Welcome everyone to another episode of the DJP. On this episode, my guest is Lodro Rinzler. Lodro is a meditation teacher and author of 7 books, as well as the co-founder of Mindful Meditation Studios in New York City. His books Walk Like a Buddha and The Buddha Walks Into the Office both have received Independent Publisher Book Awards. Lodro has taught meditation for 20 years in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and frequently travels for his books, having spoken across the world at conferences, universities, and businesses as diverse as Google, Harvard University, and the White House. He was named one of the 50 innovators shaping the future of wellness by SONIMA. Rinzler's work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Good Morning America, CBS, and NBC. It was a super great pleasure for me to be able to talk to him. We had a really nice conversation about Buddhism, mindfulness, compassion, and a lot more. So I hope that you enjoy. Without further ado, Lodro Rinzler.
You might catch yourself sliding in and out of a hallucinatory state. Just relax and enjoy it. Just relax and enjoy it.
This is an experiment in mind formation. Information. Forming, controlling, operating your mind and your brain. Using digital techniques to overload, scramble, confuse, unfocus your mind. The natural state of the brain is chaos. Chaos is beautiful.
So Lodro Rinzler, How are you today, first of all?
I'm good. Yeah, all is well over here.
Excellent. Glad to hear it. So, like we were just talking about, I read your book, and like I said, I absolutely love it. You wanna just kind of fill everybody in on a little background about you? I read in your book, you had Buddhist parents, and you started meditating very early in life, comparatively.
Yeah, you know that. So my parents raised me in a Buddhist household. It was in New York City, so it wasn't anywhere that surprising in the grand scheme of things. But I grew up meditating starting when I was about 6 years old, and then started doing retreats when I was around 11 or so, and continued to do so into my later teens, at which point I sort of went full tilt, meaning that I spent time at a monastery. I started doing month-long retreats and longer. And then by the time I reached my university age, I really had sort of, I started a little meditation group there, and I had started to host teachers to come and speak to it. And they all sort of got tired of making the drive, and they turned to me and said, listen, you've been doing this long enough. You have the prerequisites for a teacher training yourself. Why don't you just go ahead and do that? So I ended up starting to teach at a very young age. At this point, I'm 39. It was 21 years ago. Right. That I started doing that. So it's been, it's not like I then was a great enlightened person at the age of 18. Of course not. But, it's been a really interesting sort of mix of getting into, the practices and the study deeper and deeper, as I myself have also started to deepen my own relationship to teaching.
Right on. Yeah. So who did you do your teacher training under?
Yeah. So I did a series of them. I did, having been born and raised in the Shambhala Buddhist tradition, I started there. And then I continued to study at this point under Venerable Keeling Rinpoche, who's a teacher in the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. And if someone's listening to this and they're like, none of those words make sense, very briefly.
They make perfect sense to me. Right.
Yeah. I mean, you and I sort of get it. But, for someone who may not be as familiar, Tibetan Buddhism is one of many types of Buddhism out there. Right. And within that, there's, 4 or so main branches, one of which is the Nyingma tradition. And that's the one I've studied the most in. Dalai Lama, for example, is more in the Gelugpa tradition. We sort of know him, and that's the thing. There's also the Kagyu tradition and the Sakya tradition. So there's different branches, we could say, of the same tree, and each has just a different emphasis. So the Nyingma tradition is really sort of been a big part of my heart for a long time. And in the last several years, I've really deepened my study with Keeling Rinpoche, who's really lovely, wonderful, humble teacher. And I continue to sort of get guidance from him, both for my practice and also for my teaching.
That's awesome. People that aren't familiar with being in kind of the Buddhist world would be just surprised at how how deep it goes, how deep the lineages go, all the way back to the Buddha, pretty much. And just the sheer network of Buddhists in America today is pretty amazing, considering that, it's fairly new to the United States in relation to the 2,500 years or so that Buddhism has existed. I think it was the 70s, basically, when Buddhism really made its first real impact in America with Jack Kornfield and Sharon Salzberg and Joseph Goldstein.
Yeah, it's an interesting one where we live in interesting times, for sure. And we could say that in a multitude of ways. But when it comes to Buddhism coming to America, I always joke that it used to be that if you wanted to study Japanese Zen, you would have to get on a plane and go to Japan. And if you wanted to go study Tibetan Buddhism, you'd have to find a way into Tibet.
Right.
And, having grown up in New York City, we called it the Dharma district, that somewhere in the 20s that you had, a Japanese Zen place, you had a Kadampa place, you had another Tibetan Buddhist place, you had Insight Center. Like there's all these things are just sort of blocks of each other. So you could actually make an afternoon of it if you timed it right and try 4 different traditions and see what's actually resonating with you. And then you add in the, real proliferation of teachings that have come up online. There's so many wonderful teachers that I would not normally be able to travel and study with just based on my own finances and time. And yet they've brought so many things online that I can now do so. So it's, say what you will about the sort of addiction of technology that we all have. But I do think that it's actually allowed us to access the teachings in a way that we never could have even 100 years ago. It's sort of amazing. I think Buddhism going from India to Tibet and becoming Tibetan Buddhism took hundreds of years before they would call it Tibetan Buddhism. It was just sort of this thing that was there in Tibet.
Right.
And I do wonder, as we start to look at all these things, even you mentioned Insight, some of these early teachers like Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg, and so on. At what point is the Insight tradition an American Buddhist lineage? At what point is other traditions coming out of Tibet or coming out of Japan start to say, no, we're actually American Buddhist? It would be really interesting to see how that develops.
Yeah, that will be really fascinating. And I guess only time will tell. But yeah, that's kind of my lineage, is the Theravada and more Vipassana insight. I train under what used to be one of the branches of Against the Stream. It's a Wild Heart Meditation Center in Nashville now. So that's who I've been studying under. And I actually sit with a Zen monk fairly regularly. He actually just got back into town from Europe. He was over there working at some of his Zen centers. So I dabble in a few different lineages, and and they all kind of resonate with me. But in the framework of your lineage, and let's just talk about your book.
Sure.
Take Back Your Mind.
Mm-hmm.
And this is basically a Buddhist approach to dealing with anxiety. Am I correct?
Yes, thank you. I'm always so bad about actually talking about my own books, which is a real shame because I do put some effort into writing them. Yeah, so this is a book that came out a few months ago. This is called Take Back Your Mind, Buddhist Advice for Anxious Times. And it really was born in the midst of the pandemic. I had started writing something on anxiety beforehand, and then I sort of realized I had to pick up my pace when the pandemic hit, and completed it during it and got it out. I suppose we're still during it, but very much in the midst of it. And it's been an interesting thing. I feel like anxiety is sort of a monkey on many people's backs, and we don't talk about it. And it's always been a thing with me. It's like, if I can't find someone already writing and talking about the thing, it's like, all right, then I'll start the conversation. And it sort of felt like that with anxiety, where I do feel like it's not something that we would often sit around the dinner table with friends and say, okay, what do you do when you get really anxious? It's just, for whatever reason, considered a topic that's off limits. So I really want to open up the conversation and say, listen, there's way too many of us actually struggling with this. We need to actually find ways to relate to the mind, and actually, in this case, as I say, take it back from anxiety and take it back to where, coming out of the Buddhist tradition, we can actually relax into the present moment and find a sense of peace that's already waiting for us. But it takes a little training to get there. So that's really what this book is about. And, I think similar to what you were saying before with your own background, it pulls from all different traditions. I'm heavily influenced by Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Zen master. Right. Sharon Salzberg is actually a dear colleague and a friend. And obviously other Tibetan Buddhist influences are in there as well. So it's sort of all over the place in terms of influences, right, in hopefully. cohesive way, but it gives us access to a wide variety of meditations and also just on the spot practices that will allow us to catch ourselves when we're spiraling into what if thinking and come back into the present moment, come back to what we can actually train the mind to be in connection to, which is our innate peace.
Yeah. Yeah. Those what ifs and if onlys, they'll get you every time.
Every time. A lot of time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's so interesting to me. Just the framework of both depression and anxiety. Depression, has been described to me as regrets of decisions made in the past, which obviously we can't change because the past no longer exists. And anxiety is, worry of the future, which, really never comes because we're always in the present moment. So training, getting people into a practice that helps bring them back to the present moment. It's been repackaged as the mindfulness movement that's been going on for, quite a while now. But, you and I both know that it's just basic samadhi practice. It goes back to meditation. Meditation's been around for a long time. Before there was even a word for meditation, when it was, I can't even think of the Pali term for it. Bhavana. Yeah.
I mean, it is fascinating that we have this moment of it becoming almost trendy. And I'm okay with it. I am, it's like anything that makes it socially acceptable for people to sit with it and get to know their own minds.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it wasn't that long ago when, we go back to the 50s or something. And if you said, hey, I'm going to go for a run, people would say, wait, who's chasing you? It just was not considered something that we did, that we would take care of the body. And now we've got, hopefully it doesn't go like this with meditation, but we've got 10,000 versions of ways that you can get fit.
Right.
That have been made up since then. It's not a long time. And people are obsessed with it and they build their life around it and things like that. And that's great. It's good to take care of the body. Yeah. And here we are at the tip end of everyone having that sort of craze around, I meditate. I actually work with my mind. Mm-hmm. And it has the same thing of like, instead of just relating to the body, I work with my mind as well. I really could see it going in this direction where these things become more and more socially acceptable. And I think we've already seen in the last 10 years or so that people are saying like, it's your uncle, it's your doctor, it's your, childhood friend who you never thought would actually do it. I actually had a friend from high school who, was the last person I ever thought would meditate and said, oh yeah, I found you on this app. I've been listening to it. I said, oh my God, great. So I'm continuously shocked and delighted. Right. I always joke that, I grew up reading X-Men comic books, grew up meditating. It's just as shocking to me that people are interested in meditation. They might as well turn to me and be like, we'd love for you to come to our school and give a talk about the X-Men. It's just, it would be, at this point, I'm like, sure, that would make sense because it is shocking to me just how much people are now interested. And that's great. I'm so glad that, that we've hit that tipping point.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that 1000%, man, because, the more people that really take on a practice, the more people that are going to find the benefits of the practice and ultimately the better society, in my opinion, will be. Stress reduction is such a massive thing. And you noted one thing in your book, and I think it's always important. I bring this up to people a lot, is that these are practices that can help with stress, but they're not going to make you stress free. Like the Buddha never taught the end of suffering. He taught a reduction of suffering.
Yeah. I mean, it's, one could argue that at the end of the day, people might get involved with meditation because they're interested in being less stressed out, but they might end up being like, yeah, this enlightenment and end of suffering thing does sound good. But at least initially, most of us, until we become fully enlightened, we're like, oh yeah, stress reduction sounds good. And the point that you're alluding to in the book is that I'm sort of like, meditation doesn't reduce your stressful situations. It doesn't magically mean that you no longer have to report to your boss on Friday about that project, or that your family member is all of a sudden going to be completely normal and never bother you again, or whatever stresses you out. Like those things will continue to happen, but it changes, as you said, the relationship to stress. And here's what, like the mechanics, I actually think are pretty clear. And we've been talking a lot about meditation in general, but one of the main techniques that I often recommend is the mindfulness meditation, where we take an uplifted but relaxed posture. We relax with the body breathing. When we get distracted from that, we come back to the body breathing. What we're doing here is acknowledging that we don't have to chase after every thought that arises. We're retraining the mind so that it can just acknowledge those things, come back. let's say you get a weird text from that family member or an angry email from your boss, it could trigger a stressful situation. Oh my gosh, I do have to do that thing. That's not,
right.
Lineage. Like that is a thing you need to do. You need to relate to this person. How much then do you let your mental energy get lost in that?
Right.
By that, I mean, many of us, the project's due on Friday, we go, okay, I'm going to spend 90% of my mental energy playing out the potential conversations I'm going to have with my boss until Friday, at which point none of them will have actually come to reality, because I don't know about you, but I've never planned out a conversation in my head and have it go 100% the way I thought it would. No. It's just not possible. No. So, it's like, why are we wasting that mental energy?
Right.
So that's the thing that meditation helps us with, where we can acknowledge, oh yeah, I'm doing that thing again. I don't have to, I can come back to the present moment. Like it's a natural inclination that we start to develop in our bones, essentially. Oh, I see them drifting into like all these anxiety producing thoughts. I don't have to chase after them. I can come back to doing the project, being with my friend when I'm with my friend and not at work, like actually segregating those things out so it doesn't overwhelm us.
I mean, it goes right back to, the first factor of the Eightfold Path, samadhi. Those are, all thoughts are just ditties. They're views. They're just views, they're opinions. You can have all the crazy stuff going on in the world in your head, but it doesn't make it reality. And that's the big thing, is people not identifying thoughts as thoughts and accepting them as ultimate reality, when you and I both know that's absolutely not the case. And your mind will just take you away sometimes. It's really easy to get lost in that cascade of thought and just get lost and just go over the rapids.
It is. And to take it a step further, we over-identify with it. Oh, so instead of saying like, oh, I have some anxiety producing thoughts right now, like, yeah, that's pretty normal, we say, I'm an anxious person. It's just who I am. Yeah. And honestly, I imagine someone out there is listening to this and that's something that they identify as. And I mean, for you, like, I just want to say, like, that's not true. That's a story that you are telling about yourself. Mm-hmm. And the moment you give up that story is the moment you actually find some sense of liberation and a new path forward. We tell ourselves the story, I'm inherently peaceful, which is sort of a very Buddhist view, that we're inherently awake, that we're inherently good, whole, complete as is. Then lo and behold, like, it just shifts the relationship to these sorts of thoughts. Oh, it's an anxiety producing thought. That's not who I am. I'm not an anxious person. It's just a thought. Like the clouds that are going across the sky, it's going to come and go. And I don't have to just cling to it in the same way that I might have in the past.
Yeah. There was one chapter that really stood out for me. And I think it was chapter 6. I believe it was, I'm pretty sure it was chapter 6, but it was about comparison and social media and the effects of stress on people just from that alone. And that really stood out for me, especially hosting a podcast. And, obviously I want it to do well. But not attaching to the outcome is difficult. It's difficult to do the work and just do, like, it's like the Zen tea ceremony to just, pour the tea just to pour the tea, just doing the thing just to do the thing, eating just to eat, sitting just to sit. And it's difficult for me sometimes to just make the podcast just to make the podcast because, obviously if I was just doing it as an exercise in making a podcast, I wouldn't even release it. I would just leave it on my computer. But I do, because ultimately I do have the desire, not necessarily the craving, but, I would say it's a craving as well, for it to do well. But it's difficult, not comparing myself to others. They definitely get, better listener numbers, better audience numbers, more sponsorship, things of that nature. And it's hard to break out of that, especially with the glut of social media that's just a constant onslaught on our senses. And, just like you addressed in the book, everyone always shows their best life. You're not seeing the behind the scenes. You don't see the suffering on Instagram. All you see is the happy times. You don't see the behind the scenes,
Yes. I think I referred to that as success theater, right? That we're sort of performing success and what it should look like. And it's sort of a societal definition, maybe most likely not a personal definition of, oh, look, my relationship is going really well. And you look at that and you don't know that person probably is in deep financial debt. Or look I just bought my first house and,
right.
I live here all alone and I don't actually have any friends and family and whatever. They're like, we just don't know what other people's suffering is because they're performing sort of societal definitions of success. And that's, it's actually sort of sad that we sort of feel like we have to do that. And I understand the need for celebration, particularly if we are feeling down on ourselves. but it to perform it and sort of put it out there in a just like not entirely honest way, it's not very helpful for us or for others. And I think what you were saying about the podcast is, I get it. It's an interesting one, because what we're talking about, you were talking about sort of like passion, attachment, desire, which is one of these three root poisons of Buddhism, alongside aggression or anger, and also ignorance or prejudice, those being the three. So I actually was talking with a meditation student of mine earlier today, they were like, what is the distinction here? And I actually like the idea of attachment more, because, I've got a candle sitting on my desk. I smell it. I like the smell of the candle. Right. Like that, it smells good to me. There's nothing wrong with that. But if I start to say, I only want to spend my money on this candle, at some point when my mortgage comes due, I'm going to be in pain, right? Like if I continue to just obsess about this one thing and throw all of my attention and money and everything into it, at some point I'm going to cause myself more suffering than good.
Right.
So it's sort of like that with everything, having done my 7th book, and it's the same thing where I say, okay, I put a lot of effort into the book, but what's the goal? Like, what's the end game here? What's the intention?
Right.
And for me, it's never been, okay, I need to sell this many figures of books. It's always been, if someone reads it and they're actually helped by it, then I've done what I wanted to do. And I think that's really important that we sort of understand our intention, because if our intention is to be of benefit and sort of in an open-ended way, then we're probably going to be able to affect people in lots of different ways. It's that, I'm going to give a talk in a small group tomorrow. I'm teaching a class that's actually online for a couple hundred people. And it all sort of was like, if someone's affected by it positively, that's great. But it's not, if I said, no, I need this many people enrolled in that, I'm not doing these sorts of events unless they have this sort of stuff, like then I'm just creating a lot of pain and suffering for myself.
Right. Yeah. definitely taking that second arrow then, for sure. But yeah, it's like I said, it can be difficult to just do sometimes, I mean, not really, because the ultimate, ultimately the reason I started it was probably the same reason you wrote your book. It's really, it helps. If it can help others, then it's been beneficial, and that was ultimately the goal. And also, I mean, let's be realistic. It's an excellent way to network and meet people such as yourself and, extend my network further out, which is good for me. So I get that out of it. And I just enjoy doing it, I have kind of gotten to the point where I've let go expectation. I don't have any expectation with it. I do have preference, which is, a different thing than expectation for sure. But if that preference isn't met, then I'm fine. Honestly, I've been doing it for like a year and a half now, and it grows a little bit here and it grows a little bit there. But really, if I can just, if it can help one person, then I feel like it was worth it. Because ultimately the goal is to reduce suffering in the world. I think that's your end goal. I think that's my end goal. I think that's anybody who is deeply involved in this kind of practice. I think that is the goal.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. At some point, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, just the sense of like, okay, what is the ultimate benefit to actually engaging in the meditation practice? And for some people, it starts with just me and my thing, right? Like, I don't want to be less stressed out. I want to be more present, whatever it is. But the reason I'm actually totally okay with the sort of like mindfulness movement or whatever we want to call it, it's because anyone working with their mind at a certain point starts to develop real compassion for other people. They start to see ways that they have their own suffering and their own pain. So they look around a little bit and they say, oh, shoot, like my neighbor is going through something very similar to what I've gone through, a different story, but I understand that sort of pain. And our heart goes out to them in a very authentic way. Boom, compassion is born. Just because you happen to have gotten to know your suffering a little bit better, you start to see it more in everyone around you. Right. So ultimately, like all of this, I think does lead to the birth of compassion and sort of these great teachings around offering ourselves wholeheartedly to others.
Right. Well, since we're talking about compassion, let's talk about the immeasurables. Let's talk about the Brahma Viharas. Because I think that like as a root foundation, like if you're going to do any kind of meditation, I think meditating on the immeasurables is one of the more beneficial forms of meditation. You can kind of give everybody a brief description of what those are. I've done it a million times on here, but they can hear it from you this time.
Sure. Maybe sometimes it is helpful for us to hear things from other people. I get it. Yeah, I actually been teaching a series both on we started with the four immeasurables, and we went to the six paramitas or transcendental actions. So slowly working our way through this over the course of 6 months. And it's been a real joy to go very deep on each of these and spend 2 weeks at a time on each of these things.
Yes.
So for anyone who's tuning in new and hasn't heard you talk about it in the past, these four are loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And there is something really beautiful about just a slight shift in our attention. If we just drop me and my thing, my current emergency and my neurosis for a moment and turn our gaze towards another person, it radically shifts our life. It really just opens us up in different ways. So this is all about the birth of what in Sanskrit we would call bodhicitta, bodhi being open or awake, citta being heart or mind. And the sense of just living, this is the big question we've been asking ourselves, my online community for the last however many months. How much are we living with the open heart? And how much do we find ourselves closing down? And it's not, I don't think any of us are living entirely with an open heart. Like that's not where we're at. You know, I think if you're fully realized, sure, maybe. But for many of us, it's like just trying to push the boundaries a little bit beyond what we're normally comfortable with. So, you know, I'm happy to be completely compassionate with everyone except for the people that support the politician I don't like. I'm totally happy to be completely happy for everyone except for those people who don't do what I want them to do. You know, it's like where does the heart start to hit a barrier and say, oh, I'm shutting down now? And can we start to work around that? Can we start to seek to understand people a little bit better so that we can grow in our these four immeasurable qualities? So these are the Brahma Viharas, sometimes translated as sublime abodes or divine abodes, but often more colloquially, limitless ones or immeasurables, because it's this sense that this open-hearted love is just immeasurable. It's limitless. It's not like we have a finite amount of love inside of us. We have to dole it out like pie. It's a sense of we always, like, the more we cultivate these relationship to bodhicitta, the more we connect to open-heartedness, the more we find that there is to give. And so these four, very briefly, you know, loving kindness is probably a practice that many people have heard of and you can do as sort of a formal practice, which is wonderful. It's something I highly recommend for people to engage in alongside shamatha, mindfulness, or Zen, whatever you want to call it. And then the sense of compassion, very briefly, is like when someone is suffering, we are there for their suffering 100%. We are available. We see it. We are open to it. And then sympathetic joy is almost the inverse, that when someone is going to happiness, we actually rejoice in their happiness. Right. We're there for that 100%. And equanimity is actually one of the ones that gets sort of lost along the way, the more people talk about these things. But, you know, often we think of equanimity in the sense of like groundedness, rootedness. Oh, it's peace. In fact, if you go to like our common English definition in a dictionary, you'll probably find mental calmness or composure, especially in the midst of difficult circumstances, which I love as a definition.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Right? But it's like, you know, it's sort of these two things. Oh, yes, there's peace, but it's peace in the midst of the storm. You sort of need to have the storm in order to find that peace. But from the Sanskrit word is upeksha, U-P-E-K-S-H-A, and Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Zen master, will often translate as inclusiveness, which I actually sort of prefer these days. It's that sense of like, how inclusive can I be in my heart? So that I start dissolving those boundaries that I have, particularly around, I like these people, so it's easy for me to love them. I don't like these people, I'm not going to open my heart to them. There's this infinite number of people over there that I don't often try and think of because it's too vast. And saying, can I actually open my heart to all of them? So these are challenging practices, but really important ones, particularly in this time where we're finding ourselves really divided. Political divisiveness, deep social injustice, and all of these things. Even, I mean, again, I feel like the pandemic, unfortunately, has highlighted many things and drawn lines in the sand between people who are anti this versus pro this, and so on and so forth. And it's a real challenge for a lot of the people I work with to find compassion and understanding for people they're like, no, this is a national health crisis. You're not doing what I want you to do, or whatever it is. Right. So it's been a really interesting time for us all, myself included, to sort of struggle with these four immeasurables.
Right. Yeah. It's difficult in this time absolutely. But man, especially with the whole, you know, for this, against this, and just the butting heads that's going on with everyone, like across the board. You know, we were talking about social media earlier. You can see it so much in social media, and just there's so much, you know, divisiveness in the world today. So I think that radical inclusivity, you know, just bringing everyone into the heart is so important. And that's exactly what I try to practice in my life, you know, and it makes it more difficult when other people don't try to practice that, you know, but then, you know, you can't draw the line there. You know, you have to wish loving kindness to all beings, both born and unborn, you know, so it's like, I have to have compassion for Hitler. Well, yeah, Hitler too, you know, so, and that can be difficult for people to grasp that concept.
It is. Yeah. I mean, that's why I always just try to introduce it as a contemplation, right? Like, where is my love not actually reaching at this point?
Right.
You know, where everyone except for these sorts of people, or everyone, and this is what bias is, right, at the end of the day, right? Like, I am biased against these sorts of people, and these sorts of people, you know, it could be Republicans, it could be Democrats, it could be something else entirely. You know, it's just, this is the way that the mind works. I like this, I don't like this, I ignore this. And the more we look at the very root of that and how quickly we spin out and say, oh, I only like candles like this, and I dislike all other candles, and then I sort of make an identity around it. You know, I start to run into people who make candles that are other than the candle I like, and I say that they're bad people, and it spirals into pain.
Right.
So it's exactly what we were talking about before, but in a sort of self-reifying way, that the ego becomes like this massive list of labels and ideas of who we are and why other people are good or bad based on that.
Right. Yeah. And ignorance, you know, if you break it down, ignorance, it's like people just ignore, you know, and it goes right back to, you know, the 5 hindrances, you know, aversion. And it's like, you know, well, you can't just be averse to everything, because that's not good either. You can't, and that happens a lot with social media. You get into those echo chambers of people just repeating the same thing, only hearing what they want to hear, and not, you know, like any form of critical thought or critical analysis on anything is kind of gone on the internet. It's just out the window, unless you're in, you know, unless you know people that are open to critical thought, but don't try to throw that, you know, line of thinking at anyone else, because you're in for probably a bad ride at that point, because you're immediately going to be shut down, because people only hear what they want to hear. They only want to hear what they want to hear. And when we take away the conversation and we refuse to hear other people's point of view, it kills our ability to have compassion and to be, you know, in Thich Nhat Hanh's definition, empathetic, or not empathetic, but equanimous. You know, It kills our inclusivity.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's let's just put it this way. It's something that we also need to have an awareness about. And I think even just having that awareness can start to change how we live our life. Right.
And I mean, what would you recommend to people to bring about that awareness? I mean, first of all, they have to want to be aware. You know, and I think that we could go into the whole big spiel about, you know, the wheel of life and the 12 links of dependent origination. And it's like, well, okay, well, it starts with ignorance, but then you move to, what is it? Potential, I think. And then, consciousness and form. And, you know, we could rattle on about that, but people have to stop ignoring it first. You know, they have to stop ignoring that it's a thing that needs attention first. And that's the biggest thing, is waking people up to that.
Yeah. You're right. And I think that's exactly it, where it's like, what wakes us up from ignorance, connecting to our own inherent sense of awake. And people are always looking for hacks, you know, new practices, fancy visualizations. I've done all of these things. I've done a lot of different practices in my short life. And at the end of the day, whenever you dissolve the visualization, get rid of the mandala and the whole 9 yards, it's like your mind is still your mind. Can you rest with the nature of your mind or not? If you can, it almost doesn't matter what practice you're doing. It's like all of these practices lead back to that. And if you can't, then you really need to stabilize your mind.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%.
It's mindfulness. It's like, I can be honest with you that, you know, it's like, people are always like, okay, now what's the next thing? What's the next thing? It's like, you could spend, and, you know, I did spend decades just doing shamatha, just being mindful of the body breathing.
Right.
Occasionally doing loving kindness. That's a good thing to do, to add in loving kindness. In fact, I actually emphasize it more than I was raised with. Because I think, these are particularly polarizing times, and it's good for us to connect with that sense of bodhicitta, but not at the expense of mindfulness. It's in addition to.
Right.
So, it's like, I can't emphasize it enough that if someone's like listening to these sorts of things and they don't actually practice, they're missing the point. I'm being a little cruel here, but like, it's, I think that there's also, by the way, when we're talking about the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism, I remember a particular talk, and I went through the teacher under the bus, but it was a different tradition in Tibetan Buddhism. And this particular teacher was saying, all these people want to go out and meditate, but it's a little bit like you go out into the garden. If you don't know you don't know anything about botany, you don't know what seeds you're even planting, you don't know what conditions they're supposed to be in, you're just throwing it everywhere. Nothing's going to take root. So you have to study, and then eventually you meditate. I understand that sort of line of thinking. And there's schools that say, just meditate. And at some point when you study something, you'll say, oh yeah, that's the way I realized myself in meditation. And I just based on my own training and my own experience, fall squarely in the middle, which is just study and practice go hand in hand. It's good for people to listen to these sorts of things and to read good books and to take courses. But if we're not meditating, we are sort of missing the point. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think meditation really helps you see those aspects of yourself that need addressing, the shadow self, like Jung referred to it, the darker bits of yourself. And you have to acknowledge those. And like through shadow work, you kind of see those in other people, and that's a reflection of those things in yourself. So it can kind of help you along the path of, identifying the aspects that you do need to, address in your life. And I think without doing that, you really can't bring about, a right sila aspect to your practice. How do you interact with the world if you don't know how you should be interacting with the world, in a sense,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think the sila aspect is a pretty overlooked aspect of the path as well. The way you bring the Dharma into the world, and it is with loving kindness, and it is with compassion, and it is with equanimity, and it is, with sympathetic joy. That's how you treat others, because that's, it goes right back to, treat others the way you would like to be treated. Well, how do you want to be treated? That's an important question to answer first.
That's exactly right. And I think that's what it comes down to. It's like the more we actually have a relationship to ourselves, the more we discern what is skillful activity and where we want to go from there.
Right. And you mentioned in your book, you touched on wise speech and the Vaka Sutta, which has always been really big for me, because, it goes, the 4 rules of speech, basically, is it, kind? Is it timely? Is it true? And is it beneficial? And if it doesn't meet, all of those qualifications, then you probably don't want to say it. It doesn't seem to be productive.
Exactly right. And I mean, I think one of the things I reflect on frequently is just the combination of like body, speech, and mind, which is such a typical thing that we talk about, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism. But there's this sense of like, what I do with my mind will affect my activity in the way I talk. You've probably run into people where you say, how are you doing? And because their mind has been so filled with anxiety, they say, well, here's the thing I'm worried about. Right. For a while, my wife and I were watching Breaking Bad before we would go to bed. And then we would both have horrible nightmares. And we're like, wow, wonder why that is. It was the fact that we were engaging in activity that affected our mind. Not surprising, right? So it's like these things all affect each other. And I think that's the thing, is like the more we know what we're doing with the mind mercifully, the more it affects our speech. We become more skillful there, become more skillful in our activity. And it's just a gradual development for all of us. I don't think there is a moment that we hit the light switch and it all is like running seamlessly, but it's gradual, month over month, year over year development in the direction that we feel is meaningful.
Yeah. That brings the old colloquialism, you are what you eat, to mind. Because if you look at nutrition in a sense, like, well, you kind of are what you eat. If you eat healthy, if you eat, fresh vegetables, if you do eat meat, if you eat, grass-fed meats, and if you're not consuming a lot of sugar and not consuming a lot of fat, and then you're going to be healthier. So if you're not consuming poor mental nutrition, you're going to be mentally healthier. the mind does have a tendency to incline itself to what you surround it with. So if you're surrounding it with Breaking Bad, you're obviously going to have horrible dreams because, it's not really a positive message in that show.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, it just seems, I look at the world and I operating from this, I try to operate from this place of compassion, and I don't want to say it's difficult, but it's difficult. What's difficult for me is doing this immense amount of work, because let's be realistic. Anybody who pursues this practice and meditates knows that meditation is not this blissed out, peaceful, stress-free experience. Like, it can be a pretty dark experience. The Zen monk I sat with, Claude Anshin Thomas, he said, meditating is like sitting on a bomb and waiting for it to go off. And that really struck a chord with me because, that's when the thoughts really run rampant. Like, if you think your thoughts run rampant throughout your normal day, just go sit on a cushion for a little while and see what pops up,
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where many people get stuck, that they think they should be able to meditate once and have it feel like a massage or a deep bath, as opposed to what it does feel like, which is sort of a waterfall of thoughts, just one after another. And they think maybe meditation's making me more wild. In fact, the mind has always been wild. It's just that we haven't really had a look at it. And now we're actually starting to get to know it. And the more we do, the less overwhelming it feels.
So your book's about anxiety, and just like you addressed in the book, and just like we've been talking about now, it is just so overwhelming currently. Like, the anxiety level seems to just be, I don't know if I've ever seen a more anxious time in my life. We're about the same age. I'm 40. I just turned 40 this year. So we're right in the same, we grew up around the same time. And this is just the most anxious time that I've personally ever experienced in my life. And I'm so thankful to have this practice to be able to reduce the amount of stress, to be able to look at everything kind of through that Dharma lens and be like, okay, all right, well, this is impermanent and it's not going to be like this. This is just how it is right now. But people get so wrapped up in the stories they tell themselves, and, they start to believe all the crazy things they tell themselves. And I think Alan Watts had a really good quote about anxieties, and all the anxiety and worry in the world isn't going to change the outcome from being the outcome. Like, the thing is still going to happen. You can worry about it until you're blue in the face, but it's not going to change it from happening.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. And yet it doesn't often stop us from really, as we talked about earlier, playing out some of these what if thinkings. What if this happens? What if that happens? And it's very alluring. We've really trained the mind in that particular direction. And now we sort of have to take a step back and train it in a way that actually feels more meaningful for us.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. So where can people find your book at?
Yeah, I mean, mercifully, it's wherever books are found these days, which is often online. I know. I think, you could probably go and order it from the local independent bookstore, but also like Bookshop, which organizes.
Sweet. Pretty wide distribution then.
Yeah. So like Bookshop.org, go
awesome.
to Amazon if you want to do that sort of thing. And so there was at like Target and Walmart, which is interesting. I don't know how these things end up where, but it's generally available. So Take Back Your Mind, Buddhist Advice for Anxious Times.
Awesome. Well, man, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. We'll have to do this again sometime for sure. I would really like to pick your brain a little more, and it's excellent getting to know you. It's always nice to meet fellow people on the path. And
yeah, thank you so much for having me on. And, for people who are listening at home, and, I feel like I was a little strict about you've got to meditate. And it's true. I am strict about that because it's like we can talk about the sutras and the four measurables and the rest of it as much as we want. And if people aren't going to practice it, then it's going to not really, as I said earlier, take root. But, I do think, as you said, these are really difficult times for many people. And the flip side of this is I want people to feel like they can start where they are. That if that means you start with 10 minutes a day of meditation. Right. That's a really good place to start.
Right.
And there's no shame in saying, okay, that's all I can make room for at first. And then it can grow over time, the more we actually sort of fall into the rhythm and enjoyment of it even. So I really appreciate you doing this work that you're doing and making these things really accessible for people. And I hope people listening at home feel encouraged in their practice.
Please pick up a dedicated meditation practice if you haven't already. And it's just like Lodro already said, 5-10 minutes to begin with. Just get your feet wet. Just see what it does for you.
Yeah.
Because I guarantee it'll help. I know it helped me. It's helped me through a lot of tough times, and it still does. And it's, I think it's also important to note that the meditation doesn't really stop when you get off the cushion. It's approaching your life mindfully, and that's how we avoid those pitfalls, is by being in the present moment and having that present time awareness, and not letting ourselves use unwise speech or do unwise action, and just really strengthening that path, man. And I think it has the potential to help a lot of people and change the world if they would just take the time to do it.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%.
Cool. Well, thanks again, man. I really appreciate it, and I will hopefully talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Thanks again to Lodro Rinzler for being on the show. If you would like to get in touch with him, he can be found at lodrorinzler.com. If you enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the show on either Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you for listening. This has been Dharma Junkie. Namaste.
Chaos is beautiful.